Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we're currently looking at is Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. This is a warm hug of a book, and I'm going to look at it in two parts, each with 4 sections. The first part is called simply Fungi, with sections called Full Spectrum Fungi, Relationship Fungi, Networked Fungi, and Killer Fungi. And the second part is called Fungi and Us, with sections called Culture, Economy, Thought, and Identity. So, beginning with part 1, Full Spectrum Fungi. And I've called it this because one of the things that really jumps out from Sheldrake's book is the bewildering range of its existence, the staggering scale of time and space it occupies, the incredible reach of its powers, and the sheer magnitude of its achievements. In its existence, very few of us would have any idea that there are 4 to 5 million species, and these are in fact everywhere, from the seafloor, the surface of deserts, the frozen valleys of Antarctica, rubbish dumps and carpets, floorboards and old books, house dust and the canvases of old paintings, our guts and orifices, and even in the air that we breathe. Its presence in time and space is equally monumental. It's been around for more than half of the 4 billion years of our life's history, and its mycorrhizal mycelium makes up between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the living mass of soils, whose total length from the top 10 centimetres of soil, if it was laid out in one really long line, would span approximately half the width of our galaxy. In its power, if some fungal hyphae were as wide as a human hand, it would be able to lift an 8-ton school bus. It can eat through rock, digest pollutants, and it crunches through asphalt. And it can find the shortest path between 2 points in a labyrinth. And in the book, Sheldrake details experiments where slime mould replicates the trajectory of Tokyo's rail system, the US and the UK motorway network, and the shortest path to an IKEA exit. More spectacularly, it turns away from objects without making contact, can detect light as low as that from a single star, and can sense an opening 3 times shallower than the gap between tracks on a CD. But its achievements are perhaps the most spectacular of all, responsible for all recognisable life on land, and capable of withstanding what for humans would be 12,000 times the lethal dose of radiation, and tolerating immersion in liquid nitrogen at minus 195 degrees. It thrives in the fuel tanks of aircraft, was the first living thing to emerge after Hiroshima, and is flourishing in the ruins of Chernobyl. This then is Full Spectrum Fungi, nature's most phenomenal polymath, committed to life and an expert in life's relationships, which brings us to section 2. And I've called this Relationship Fungi because, perhaps more than any other species, fungi is committed to relationships, and in this they're the living instruments, not of evolution but involution, the rolling and curling inwards towards other forms of life. They are gender fluid, queer, open to otherness, and promiscuous. And Sheldrake gives 2 great examples of this. The first is the lichen, whose desire for relationship and the open embrace of otherness has seen it merge with a wholly different species, that of an algae, an organism with different origins whose genes evolved separately over millions of years, and these have come together in the single and visible body of the lichen, a combination of fungus and algae trading nutrients for carbon-based energy. Now, neither of these could survive alone, but together, as Sheldrake has it, they are singing a single metabolic song in perfect harmony. And really, this is the meaning of symbiosis, otherwise known as the intimacy of strangers, and the lichen is its living embodiment. But if the lichen offers the deepest of cosmopolitan unions, It's the second example that Sheldrake gives us, the association of plants and fungi, which is both the most pervasive and the most promiscuous of these relationships. Because unlike lichens, plants and fungi do not come together to make a single body, and so they remain free agents. So a single plant can couple with as many fungi as it likes, and a single fungi can get it together with as many plants as it wishes, in a kind of reciprocal dance, whereby the mycorrhizal fungi scavenges in the soil and burrows into the rock to mine minerals and nutrients for their plant partners. And in exchange, the plants welcome them into their roots, giving them the gift of carbon-based energy. A win-win exchange, and another example of the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. And these relationships, the relationships between plants and fungi, have evolved over millions of years to manage their complicated affairs, so that neither plant nor fungi can gain complete control or hijack the relationship and turn it to their exclusive benefit. A bit like the song that he loves so much, the women gathering mushrooms, with their many songs coalescing into one. But having said this is still very much a trade of nutrients for energy. And here Sheldrake, quoting others really, brings a very different tone and a different language to his description. And it's really the tone and the language of the free market, whereby plants and fungi strike compromises and resolve trade-offs and deploy strategies of preferential supply and reciprocal rewards and buying low and selling high in variable exchange rates determined by changing contexts and the dynamic of supply and demand. And it's in their vast, complex and collaborative systems of shared mycorrhizal networks sending out billions of chemical call and response signals that makes all of this possible, which Sheldrake says if you could feel into the sound of the soil, it would be like the performance of a jazz group. Which brings us now to section 3. And I've called this network fungi, because fungi are not just the masters of the mycorrhizal networks, they are the network, one great membrane of forming and reforming connections, bathed in chemical information in shimmering and unceasing turnover, where anywhere between hundreds and billions of hyphal tips are all integrating and processing information at the same time and on a huge scale. And here, fungi speaks very much to our modern sensibilities with the idea of the network as the ubiquitous and the hypertrophied master concept of the 21st century. But unlike AI or systems theory, this is a living network whose existence requires not that it puts food in its body, but that it puts its body in food. And because it has to embed itself in such an unpredictable source of nourishment, it must constantly search and constantly shapeshift, making it a living and growing opportunistic investigation, or what Sheldrake calls speculation in bodily form. And the way he describes this is, he says, they start their speculative journeys exploring in all directions and able to choose all possible routes at once, negotiating a chemical maze with millions of hyphal tips like a frenzy of self-dribbling basketballs. Yet, as it sprawls, it has to stay in touch with itself. And it has to do this without any centre of control, without any head or brain. It has, Sheldrake says, no capital cities or seats of government. And yet experiments show them making decisions with a kind of brilliance really, operating both as a single interconnected entity as well as a multitude of hyphal tips, so that if one hyphal tip discovers food, it instantly reconfigures the entire network, constantly sending messages to the different parts of itself about food, injury, the presence of other organisms, and the right moment to do such things as produce a circle of mushrooms in a synchronized flush. And the scaled up manifestation of this is the glorious spectacle of the Wood Wide Web, woven together by mycelium as a mass of networked transport systems, not a thing but a happening, a fusing and a constantly reconfiguring system through which water and nutrients and signalling compounds and electrical activity flow across from plants and trees, allowing them to share resources and to communicate in a kind of chemical Esperanto. And this is how the mycoheterophs, those plants pretending not to be plants who've lost their leaves and their capacity to photosynthesize, this is how they survive through the carbon of other plants. It's how phosphorus passes from the roots of dying plants to healthy ones, how young trees with few connections are nurtured by old trees with many, how plants and trees issue chemical warnings when attacked, and how the resources of the forest move from areas of abundance to those of scarcity. Here's how Sigourney Weaver puts it in the film Avatar.
What we think we know is that there's some kind of electrochemical communication between the roots of the trees, like the synapses between neurons. And each tree has 10 to the 4th connections to the trees around it. And there are 10 to the 12th trees on Pandora.
Which is a lot, I'm guessing.
It's more connections than the human brain. Get it? It's a network.
Well, I think you'll all agree that Sigourney sounds very enthusiastic there, and it does sound wonderful, a kind of myco-utopia. In Sheldrake's words, places of caring, sharing and mutual aid, free from rigid hierarchies and the competition for resources. But Sheldrake doesn't really mean it, and he's very quick to remind us that myco-utopia is still a utopia, whose shared networks are not always beneficial. In some cases, they offer a fungal fast lane for poisons and toxins, and the same Darwinistic biological imperative to reproduce yourself by any means can sometimes express itself in a dark way, which takes us to the final section of this first part. And this is called Fungi Killers for obvious reasons, and Sheldrake gives us 2 fantastic examples. The first is the cordyceps fungi, which takes over carpenter ants, enmeshes their muscles in fibres of mycelium, and hijacks their nervous system, controlling their behaviour with mind-boggling precision, stripping them of their instinctive fear of heights, having them climb up nearby plants to a height of exactly 25 centimetres, then clamping their jaws in a death grip around the plant, synchronised with the other infected ants, all of which are orientated to do so in the direction of the sun, after which the mycelium stitches the ant's feet to the surface of the plant, allowing it to digest its body, and finally, in its pièce de résistance, sprouting a stalk through its head to shower spores on the ants below. Or some might prefer the Massapora fungus, which infects cicadas, causing the rear 1/3 of their bodies to disintegrate, while they become hypersexual as their genitals crumble away to become what Sheldrake describes as salt shakers of death, discharging fungal spores out of their ruptured backs in a flurry of future fungal life. Now, all of this is pretty horrendous stuff, but as gruesome as they are, these are really only examples to temper what is in effect an extended celebration of fungi. And throughout, Sheldrake makes his position clear. We are unthinkable without them, and their collective flourishing underpins our past, present and future, which takes us logically enough to part 2, Fungi and Us, and its first section on culture. And in many ways, Sheldrake's book is itself a cultural expression of our long and profound relationship with fungi, a relationship that's lasted longer than we've been Homo sapiens. And Sheldrake illustrates this with reference to a 50,000-year-old Neolithic corpse which had been carrying wads of fungus to make fire and eating from a penicillin mould for what sounds like a really bad toothache. But the really big thing that's grabbed hold of us as a species is the mind-altering qualities of mushrooms and yeast, both of which have penetrated our culture, shaped our spiritual life, and even transformed our societies. And in the stoned ape thesis, articulated by people like Terence McKenna, it's argued that psilocybin mushrooms were like a revolutionary explosion in the human brain, enabling language and thought, self-reflection and poetry, spirituality and ritual to erupt from the darkness of the hominid mind, all of which is evidenced in cave paintings of mushroom-sprouting deities and hundreds of mushroom-shaped statues from the 2nd millennium BCE. And then there's the bread and beer thesis, which argues that our move from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists, with all the massive changes that came with that, cities and hierarchy and states, was essentially a cultural response to yeast, with bread and beer pulling our nomadic forebears to a life on the land. A thesis which is most persuasively argued by James Scott and also Noah Harari, though I must say is currently being demolished and dismantled by a wonderful new book called The Dawn of Everything, which will be the subject of a future film. So like mushrooms, alcohol conjured from fruit into beer, grain into wine, and nectar into mead, was conceived as a divine energy and woven into human culture from ritual feasting to statecraft across the ancient world, with the power, Sheldrake tells us, to forge and corrode cultural categories. And this power, the power to alter our minds, is still very much with us. It was central to the countercultural movement of the 1960s, and today it continues in new movements of radical mycology, where citizen scientists and DIY growers, entrepreneurs and fungi evangelists run schools and conferences and crowdsource projects sharing an explosion in fungal knowledge, which is increasingly shadowed by mainstream science, now rapidly catching up with ancient wisdom. All of which has been driven not just by curiosity, but also by the multiple crises of mental and planetary health. And to both of these, the secrets of fungi are out and the evidence is in, including medical trials demonstrating psilocybin's really quite miraculous ability to cure anxiety, depression, existential distress and hopelessness, as well as inducing mystical experiences and a direct encounter to a sense of deeper, interconnected reality beyond ego and beyond time and space, with patients immersed in feelings of joy and love, leaving powerful and long-lasting improvements in their well-being. And if we move for a moment from the transcendent to the tarnished, it's also becoming ever more clear that fungi's unique power to digest and decompose can be harnessed in our attempt to save nature from the deluge of our waste and toxins. Like jailers with bunches of enzyme keys, their capacity to unlock chemical bonds enables them to break down a huge amount of our bad stuff, including crude oil and plastics, explosive TNT, herbicide, pesticides and synthetic hormones, all of which makes them indispensable as we transition to a non-polluting, non-carbon economy. Bringing us to section 2. And in the post-polluting, post-carbon economy, the power of fungi has much to offer, not only in breaking materials down, but also in the creation of new materials, with many new companies becoming the outliers of a new and nascent fungal economy, partnering with outlets like IKEA, fashion designers like Stella McCartney, government departments like NASA, all of whom using waste streams to produce fungal furniture and fungal materials, replacing bricks and concrete, plastics and leather, and even graphite in lithium batteries. And at the far end of this emerging innovation, Sheldrake tells us of an international consortium of scientists and designers working to create a building made entirely of fungus, with a structure built from mycelial compounds and computing circuits engineered around mycelial networks. And in all of this, in our study and our knowledge and our use of fungi, we are utilising new ideas, but also challenging old ones, which brings us to section 3. And here, I think that thinking and the way that fungi challenges our thinking is for Sheldrake personal. And you really do sense that he means it when he says that fungi is so other, so outside of our experience, that it's not possible to understand it through the existing categories of human thought, or even our necessary but rather well-worn metaphors. And I think he puts this really nicely when he says it's not comfortable to sit in the space created by open questions. Agoraphobia can set in, and it's tempting to hide in small rooms built from quick answers. And this temptation to quick answers is why we're always looking for human comparisons as a start point and an anthropocentric yardstick against which all other species can be measured, clinging to the great hierarchy of intelligence drawn up by the ancient Greeks, with humans always at the top and followed by animals who look like us. And that's part of why we're addicted to metaphors, which themselves are infused with ideological positions, presenting mycorrhizal fungi, for instance, as socialism in the soil, or unregulated market capitalism, or even fungal feudalism. And these limitations are evident in the debate that Sheldrake frequently refers to in the book around mycorrhizal networks, intelligence, and the brain, with some enthusiasts arguing that fungal networks allow for the chemical transmission of information across constantly reconfiguring mycorrhizal synapses. In other words, they are something akin to a brain, while skeptics enumerate the countless ways that this just isn't true. But for Sheldrake, and in a way of thinking I think follows that of Ian McGilchrist, we should drop these either-or debates, go beyond anthropomorphism, loosen the grip of familiar thinking, and utilise our imagination to become open to a deeper reality. In other words, to do exactly what psilocybin has enabled us to do since the dawn of history, to bypass our default mode network and open up new ways of thinking so that we may imaginatively comprehend that speaking does not always require a mouth, hearing does not always require ears, and interpreting does not always require a nervous system. And let fungi be themselves free from our imposed templates as life forms which solve problems, communicate, learn, remember, and make decisions. And this leads to the final section on identity, because if this seems difficult, it's only a small part of a larger existential challenge that the study of fungi and the developments of microbial sciences generally pose to those who are willing to take it seriously. And that's because it shakes and dissolves the fixed distinctions and the old borders of where one individual stops and another starts, which is to say, to take fungi seriously is to dispel our treasured delusions of self-identity, autonomy, and independence. Delusions which are central to our Western philosophy, politics, economics, culture, and civilization. But like the astonishing powers of fungi, the secrets of such self-delusion are out and the evidence is in. And this reveals us as ecosystems which span boundaries and transgress categories, which, like all complex multicellular organisms, including human life, is a story of the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. And it's just no longer possible to conceive of any organism as distinct from the micro-communities which share their bodies, which, as a blind man's cane becomes part of his sensory apparatus, are the enabling forms of life that our existence depends on. So, long before we might become cyborgs, as predicted by Noah Harari in his Homo Deus, we have, like all other forms of life, and for millions of years, been symborgs, immersed in the larger symbiosis of densely interconnected life. A fact only now becoming visible to science, but which would have been seen, known and lived by the stoned ape, courtesy of the world-making, mind-changing, future-shaping fungi. So concludes Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, which I'll critique in the next film in the series.